So, good evening and welcome to our public lecture. So, this is one of the important parts of both our mid-year meeting and our annual meeting. We have the opportunity to invite a distinguished person from any field, very often academicians, but not always, to tell us about what they are doing, and which is always interesting, and to enlighten us. And we get to hear things that we would often not normally hear in the course of the regular scientific discussions that we have over here. So today it's a great pleasure to have with us Professor Seema Alavi, who is currently a professor at Ashoka University in Sonipat. And so prior to that, she initially she did her PhD in Cambridge University, and then when she returned to India, she has served in a number of academic institutions, JNU, Jamia Millia Islamia, and Delhi University, before finally moving to Ashoka in 2022. And she is one of India's most well-recognized historians. And her what she is going to talk about today is the influence about how the colonial, the British influenced the system of Unani medicine and its evolution into what it eventually became. She has written a number of books, and one of them recently was awarded a very prestigious prize called the Albert Hourani Award, and it's called Muslim Cosmopolitanism in the Age of Empire. And this was also awarded the Monsoon Book Award in 2025. Another recent book of hers is on Sultans of the Sea. It's on the Omani their I guess maritime history again in the age of the empire. She's also had visiting fellowships in a number of different prestigious places in Cambridge University and in Harvard University, to name a few. So we're very happy to have her here today, and we look forward to her lecture. Thanks for coming.
So I can speak in this, or I can have that. Let me see. I think this should be fine. Yeah. If there's a problem, then I'll let you.
If you want to move around, you don't want to move around.
I don't think I'll move around. So, I just want to ensure that I know how to move this. So thank you so much for inviting me to this talk, to give this public lecture. It's really an honor and a challenge also for me to keep your attention going for 45 minutes. Before I begin, I would really like to thank the Indian Academy of Sciences, its director, Professor Vardarajan, for inviting me. I would like to thank the secretaries of the Indian Academy of Science, Dr. Gaiti Hassan and Dr. B. Gopal, for having me here. And of course, the executive secretary, Mr. Mahesh Chandra, for so nicely organizing all the logistics of my travel and stay, which has been extremely pleasant. So thank you so much. It's really an honor. And I hope that I can keep your attention going, and I hope I can do justice to all the hospitality and the warmth that I have received from all of you since last evening. So let me begin. In 2014, the newly installed National Democratic Alliance government in India established a new ministry for traditional healing practices, which probably you know of, the Ayush Ministry. It included Ayurveda, Yoga, Unani, Siddha, and homeopathy, as you can see in this slide. Its objective was to incorporate knowledgeable traditional healers and practitioners into the national health program. The Ayush Ministry was strongly criticized by the Indian Medical Association, a body of biomedical practitioners, on grounds that it diluted medicine's scientific orientation. But I think more importantly, it faced a strong backlash from the liberal intelligentsia on grounds that this was a backhand way of forcing Ayurveda and the other more Indic rooted traditions into the national healthcare system, leading, they argued, to the marginalization of Unani that had Greco Arab origins and was identified closely with Islamic learning. This controversy reflected, of course, amongst other things, the entangled histories of medicine, religion, and politics. These have seldom remained in watertight compartments and have been shaped by each other in no small measure. I looked this evening at these entangled histories in the context of Unani, a Greco Arabic system of medicine which came to India in the 13th century following the Turco Afghan conquests of the subcontinent. I will focus on Unani's encounter with English medicine following the British conquest of India, in particular in the 18th century, and elaborate on the efforts of its practitioners to make most of the colonial context to create an exceptional medical modernity for Unani, one that retained the Greco-Arabic legacy with which it had come as its core, and at the same time institutionalize and professionalize itself through the long period of British rule in India in which it evolved. So let me begin by talking about what is exactly Unani medicine. So Unani is a Greco-Roman system of medicine that was adopted by Arab Muslims in the age of classical empires. By the 12th century, it had come to be regarded as an integral part of Islam's intellectual legacy. It was represented as a form of Galenism that meant the synthesis of various Greek philosophical influences that shaped Galen's notion of human procreation and the body. He, like Aristotle and Hippocrates, viewed the universe as the macrocosm that was perfectly reflected in, he argued, the human microcosm. And like them, he too was of the view that the human body had a hierarchy of oppositions and correspondences, what he called the humors. These had to be kept in balance with elements of nature to maintain good health. Thus, in Unani tradition, health was very much part of social well-being. And this emphasis on society and nature as important reference of good health meant that Unani put the spotlight also on the ruler, the king. In a very Aristotelian understanding, Unani healers maintained that the kingdom was like the body and the king its physician. Just like a physician maintained good health via the balance of humors, the king ensured a healthy body politic through maintenance of social equilibrium. Not surprisingly, and this was interesting for me it was a revelation to me, Aristotle was revered in Unani medical circles. By the 13th century, Unani medicine had acquired a truly global character that corresponded interestingly to the cultural, political, and trading contours of an expanding Islam. Significantly, because the expanding world of Muslims, Darul Islam, embraced Christian, Jewish, Hindu, and a range of other civilizations, Unani was never imprinted only with the seal of Islam alone. Thus, Unani, though very much identified with Islamic learning and Muslim rulers, remained distinct always from Muslim religious practice and observance. Its practitioners, called Hakims, the wise men, acknowledged its cultural heterogeneity and preferred to call it Unani medicine, Greek medicine, rather than Islamic or Muslim medicine. Now, in this map, you can see, following the arrows, the pink areas, the arrival of Unani from this Greco-Arabic world into India in the 13th century with the conquest of the Turco-Afghan rulers into the Indian subcontinent. The Mughal emperors coming to India, the Mughal emperors in India patronized Unani medicine, called it Unani, not Muslim, not Islamic medicine. The courts of all Mughal emperors attracted practitioners from Iran and Central Asia. The collapse of the Iranian Safavid Empire ensured that many of the more famous Iranian Hakims migrated to Mughal India in the 16th, 17th centuries. In the Mughal court, they held high positions and produced Unani manuscripts in Persian, which was, as you know, many of you would know, the official language of empire. These medical texts, by the way, this is Galen and Aristotle, the main iconic, icon of Unani medicine. And this is the Mughal emperor Babur being treated by Hakims. And I'll talk about this shortly. So the Iranian Hakims migrated to Mughal India, and in the Mughal court, they held high positions and produced Unani manuscripts in Persian. Their medical texts are interesting, and this is a picture which kind of exemplifies some of that. They upheld the humoral theory of health and used it as a model to reinforce kingship. These elite court Hakims kept knowledge of healing within their carefully guarded family traditions, making it inaccessible to those outside their circles. They wrote encyclopedic medical manuscripts that upheld aristocratic virtue and harmony with nature as the key to individual well being. The Mughal scholar physician defined a healthy body as a cultured body, one that had mastered the etiquettes and correspondence skills laid out in the literary genre of Persian texts. Tibbe-Dara Shikohi, authored by one Iranian Hakim, Nuruddin Shirazi, in the mid-17th century and dedicated to the very famous Mughal emperor Shah Jahan. Shah Jahan's son, Dara Shikoh, is one such very typical Mughal Unani text. Now just look at the description of the text. The 1780s copy prepared in Surat by a Parsi Hakim called Bijan is an encyclopedic ornate text in 3 volumes that covers approximately 3,000 pages, 3,000 folios. You can imagine how huge it is. For Shirazi, health is about individual well-being, an ideal state that can be achieved by a few only through proper comportment. This comportment is aristocratic in nature and heavily dependent on an able emperor who provides the perfect social harmony for a healthy body politic where individual well-being can be ensured. In Mughal India, such views of health as well-being remained restricted to the upper echelons of society. Ordinary people flocked to attars, dispensers of healing potions, and bone setters for their cures. Now, if you look at this slide, this is Babur, the first Mughal emperor, lying sick and ailing in bed. And these people are some of the Hakims who are curing them. And the most important part of this slide is that there is very little difference in the way they are projected between a Mughal prince, nobleman, and a hakim. They are, but they are upholding aristocratic virtue. They are part of the aristocracy, very much part of the court society, and very much integral in their dress, in their upholding of social harmony, of courtly etiquette, etc., using all of that as integral to well-being. And that well-being is, is the ideal for achieving a healthy body. I don't have pictures of Tibbe Dara Shikohi, the ornate encyclopedic text, but I have pictures of other Unani medical texts to just show you the emphasis on volume, the emphasis on the ornateness of the text, and the emphasis to make Unani medical texts bibliophile items, that they almost like an extension of the courtly decor that is so integral to the Mughal Empire. So this is one. This is my favorite, where it's a random painting where in a Mughal Unani text you have this romance scene picture, kind of available, which basically gives you an idea that what is a healthy body and well-being identified and associated with in Mughal literature. It's not just about nuggets of medicine and potions, but it's about a general social harmonious, kind of context. So this illustrated manuscript, as you can see, is a copy of the very famous Hakim Razi's manuscript, in which you find, these kind of pictorial depictions. So from the 18th century, that is when the Mughal emperor was, in its twilight, things began to change. This was a period when a gnawing financial crisis weakened the Mughal empire. This ensured that the state patronage to Udani Hakims, all the money which was going into the making of all these beautiful ornate texts, began to peter down, wither. With their patrons gone, elite healers like Shirazi, who I just mentioned, found it difficult to sustain closely guarded medical knowledge locked in the ornate manuscripts and texts that we just saw. Instead, these healers had to respond now in a period of imperial crisis to the needs of society that needed cures rather than mere individual well-being based on aristocratic virtue. In this period of imperial crisis, the 18th century, a drift towards user-friendly popular medical literature can be noticed in the Unani lexicon. This is just contrasted to what we saw for the Mughal period. This is the kind of user-friendly literature that pops up in the 18th century Unani compendium. So in this period, a drift towards the user-friendly literature meant that people like Hakim Ahmad Shah Arzani, whose text this is, wrote this text, which is called Mizan-e-Tib, meaning a collection of wisdom on health. The Mizan, which is here on the screen, claims to be a handbook of medicine for beginners and lays out medical wisdom rather than aristocratic virtue as the key to good health. And you can see the difference from Shirazi to Arzani. It bends more towards providing useful medical knowledge as a guarantee to individual well-being. No more aristocratic virtue. Stylistically, and you can see, it stands in sharp contrast to the voluminous and ornate Persian medical texts of the period, of the Mughal period. It is a short work of mere 48 folios, written in ordinary Persian Nastaliq style, and in sharp contrast to the Mughal texts that we saw earlier. It aims to make medical knowledge accessible to ordinary people, not lock them up for bibliophile items. These kind of texts of the 18th century offer supplementary clarifications and explanations in the margins. These marginal notes are typically in Persian, but at times the scribe translates the Persian into Hindi using Devanagari to make it easy for the lay reader to recognize the medicines that are recommended. So you can see the emphasis is on, making ordinary people understand what your medicine is and making medicine, medical wisdom, rather than comportment, the key to well-being. Thus, in this text, for instance, the Hindustani word kyora, a sweet, fragrant, edible portion for digestion, is inscribed in the margin to explain its Persian equivalent listed in the text as sharbate qadr. Written at the beginning of the 18th century period of Mughal crisis, the Mizan's easy to read style and accessibility emulates the austerity and the pragmatism associated with readily available reformist religious literature in Arabic, like commentaries on the Quran and the sayings of the Prophet, the Hadiths, that circulated in Mughal society alongside this medical literature. The influence of this religious literature was reflected also in the kind of medical texts that began to circulate in the 18th century Mughal society. For instance, for the first time, one noticed the Persian translations of Arabic texts like the Tibb-e-Nabawi or Medicines of the Prophet written abroad, now available in India. In the 15th century, the Tibb-e-Nabawi or the Medicine of the Prophet, written by the Egyptian scholar of Persian origin Jalaluddin al-Suyuti, circulated freely in the subcontinent. Such medical texts were interesting. They defined comportment not as aristocratic virtue, like in the Mughal case, but in the Arab tradition modeled on the Prophet's austere life. In such texts, the Prophet's life is to be emulated for the perfect temperament and the balance that ensures well being. Unani traditional healers remained, as you can imagine, very carefully cautious of this kind of medical literature. And they maintained, they engaged with it, but maintained a cautious distance from this kind of healing tradition text. But it's interesting that from the late 18th century, the drift towards Arabic language and literature as a referent to reorient medical learning in the long 18th century only intensified at the local level, despite the caution of Unani healers. Here, wealthy and influential notables in the countryside set up schools where increasingly Arabic was used as the language of scientific medicine. And Persian, which was earlier, as I mentioned, the language of Unani medical texts, became the sole language of polite culture and courtly etiquette. So the distinction began to be made. Medical texts in Arabic, religious texts in Arabic, polite etiquette, literary genres in Persian. By the mid 18th century, the separation of Persian polite literature and Arabic scientific literature began to create, as you can imagine, a hakim different from the one in the Mughal Empire. Health for him was about medical wisdom and useful knowledge, not anymore aristocratic virtue. But unlike, interestingly, the Western ideas of science that stayed away from religion, here there was a reliance also on the proliferating literature in Arabic on the Prophet's notion of the body, disease, and well being. The Tibb-e-Nabawi, the text that I mentioned. By the late 18th century, it's interesting that Unani had a carefully crafted scientific tone or core, but also a cautious and a little distant but cautious engagement with religious medical literature like the Prophet's medicine and, kind of engaging, brushing cautiously with its core Arabic, kind of scientific core. After the British conquest of India in the 1760s, the English East India Company that ruled India on behalf of Britain inherited this fractured legacy of medical knowledge in, in India. It had fractured between Arabic learning and Persian learning. Thus, it focused, the English company focused on the shift to Arabic learning and took it to new heights. It shifted Arabic medical learning from family schools and village teachers to an impersonal setting, but for Muslim students alone, the Calcutta Madrasa. This is a picture from, the kind of texts that were being taught in the Calcutta Madrasa, where this is a very, early distillation plant that, began to be used when Unani, in the English East India Company, shifted Unani learning to the Calcutta Madrasa. I find this very interesting. And this is a picture of the Calcutta Madrasa. So, after the company inherited the fractured legacy of Unani, it of course had to poke its nose and intervene. And the intervention was that it shifted Arabic medical learning away from family schools, village teachers, where it had kind of, dispersed after the fall of the empire, and put it in an impersonal setting for Muslim students alone, very typically British, the Calcutta Madrasa. But the academic curriculum of the madrasa is interesting because it deleted medical texts with religious orientation, like the Tibb-e-Nabawi, or the Prophet's medicine, with which, as I said, Unani was flirting, but cautiously. Clearly, Unani was being mainstreamed as the scientific medicine and being hived off its religious comportment in the madrasa. But simultaneously, by restricting Unani learning classes only to Muslim students, it was also acquiring in the Calcutta Madrasa a communitarian identity. And as many of us know, we are still living with Unani as a communitarian, stigmatized system of learning. This was a far cry from its consciously adopted neutral name, Unani, by which it was represented in the subcontinent, as I mentioned earlier, in pre-British times. The Calcutta Madrasa, set up by the first Governor General of India, Warren Hastings, in 1781, made Arabic the language of Unani medicine and sidetracked Mughal medical texts in Persian. It also dropped texts on the medicines of the Prophet, Tibb-e-Nabawi, from its reading list. The students now read comprehensive Arabic medical texts like the Shahr-e-Mojiz by Muhammad Qasim. Such texts focused more on drugs and cures rather than philosophical issues of the body and its relationship with nature. Significantly, alongside, they also read Arabic translations of European medical texts composed by company doctors associated with the madrasa. Peter Breton and John Tytler are two very, very important names that come to mind in their engagement with Unani learning and in its transformation, at least their efforts to transform it into something else. In 1829, John Tytler, an Orientalist scholar and presidency surgeon, conducted the first medical class at the Calcutta Madrasa here. Like the notables of the countryside, he too saw Arabic as the universal language of science and medicine that was understood, he said, and I quote him, from Malacca to Morocco, which was not true, he said, of Persian, Urdu, and the other vernaculars. And therefore, according to him, it was the language most suited for Unani learning or any kind of medical learning. Tytler edited for his students the Arabic medical texts that he collected from family schools and his networks in the big Bengal presidency countryside, huge Bengal presidency countryside. These texts that were being written by families, notables in Arabic, were now being collected by Tytler to be brought into this institution. He commissioned translations of European literature on body anatomy into Arabic. Details of body anatomy impacted Unani understandings of disease that was hitherto focused only on humors. Anatomy made the ideas of health more scientific and introduced cures based on diagnosis and invasive interventions, surgery, which was not there in Unani and began to be introduced now in the late 18th century. Such medical science literature was widely circulated through the use of the government lithographic press. The madrasa and the press, which is very important in the late 18th century for the dissemination of scientific medical texts, the press and the madrasa thus interestingly disembodied medical knowledge and created scholar hakims that acted as a bridge between Arabic and European medical traditions. I call them the hybrid healers, the hybrid hakims. The English East India Company chose a locally spoken vernacular language, Urdu, to carry the knowledge of the hybrid Unani and English science to the natives, quote unquote, of India, and strived to fashion a new style of indigenous practitioner who was not from the exclusive Persian or Arabic learning communities of Mughal India, as had been the case, and began to popularize this very specific, transformed kind of Unani medical learning through picking up a vernacular, Urdu, which more people knew and fewer people obviously knew Persian and Arabic, which were considered esoteric elite languages. Urdu was the language of the ordinary people and the soldiers in the camp. In the early 19th century, the company's interest in Urdu exalted its status and it became the language, very interestingly, of Western medical education in India. It was not English, it was Urdu that became the language of the hybrid healer, European and Unani, and the dissemination of this new hybrid Unani healer's knowledge was taken away from Arabic, Persian, and was disseminated through the vernacular Urdu. In 1823, the company-sponsored Native Medical Institution became the place for medical learning in Urdu. This was a new institution they established. And the government lithographic press became the site for Urdu medical book production. Huge, copious amounts of medical texts in Urdu were produced with a Unani core, but of course diversified into various pathways. Can we switch off the lights, please? So that we can see the screen. This is the Native Medical Institution's product, the native doctor in the 1820s, a hybrid healer kind of person. So the government lithographic press and the Native Medical Institution that was set up in 1823 became the site for Urdu medical book production. Both produced what came to be known as the native doctor, what you can see on the screen. He was different from the scholar hakims like Shirazi and Arzani, about whom I have been talking, and you can see he looks very different from the kind of very, noble hakims that were treating Babar in the first slide that I showed you. So both the native doctor was different from the scholar hakim of the past. Instead of learning medicine from Arabic texts, family healers, family schools, he learned aspects of Western medical science by salaried teachers in lecture rooms, like many of us do now. He represented a new class of medical practitioners who had no Arabic or Persian educational background or, interestingly, any major family medical traditions to back them. But they had a notion of public service inculcated in this institution, a new concept by the English East India Company. In contrast, again, to the scholar Hakim, who concentrated, as I mentioned in the first part of the talk, on the philosophical dimensions of disease prevention, this native doctor focused on body anatomy, physiology, and symptomatic cures. The lectures were aided by texts on body anatomy, physiology, and chemistry, specially produced for them, interestingly, in the Urdu language in this institute. This knowledge was complemented by wax and wood models on human anatomy and practical observations of dissections in dispensaries and hospitals that the native doctor visited. By the mid 19th century, this easy to access, robust hybrid medical tradition, Unani in its core, but diversified in its content, and available to the horror, I believe, of old, healing families of aristocratic background, available now in Urdu, a vernacular, easy to access, easy to read by ordinary people, offered a range of opportunities to people aspiring to become Unani Hakims, but all these decades and centuries denied entry because of not being from elite Persian Arabic knowing backgrounds. These new aspirants could now access medical knowledge in relatively easy languages, pull it out of the hold of its traditional custodians, and popularize it using the fast expanding print culture that British rule brought into India. The Unani Jinni was literally out of its elite box, up for grabs by the turn of the 19th century, with, of course, as you can see, the intervention of the English East India Company. New Urdu knowing Hakims emerged in the 19th century who were from very modest backgrounds. They critiqued both the institute as well as the Perso Arabic scholar Hakims for excluding healing reference outside their elite textual cultural world. Instead, they produced their own Unani literature in Urdu in their cheaply available Urdu medical manuals, such as the Tibb-e-Ehsani, the Tibb-e-Nabawi, etc. They diversified Unani to tap pools of knowledge that were beyond the control of both the British colonial state and the traditional elite family custodians, namely the talismans, the Sufi healings, the charms of fakirs, Sufis, as well as, of course, the medicine of the Prophet. They tried to pull in all these medical healing traditions into their text. I feel that the historic juncture of the late 19th century, in which modern capitalist infrastructure and print culture came along with the disturbances of modernity, namely famine, disease, death, and epidemics, gave these new men who promised quick ways of medical self help through their easy to read primers huge popularity. At the same time as print, the telegraph, and the steamship increased contact between the Indian subcontinent and the Ottoman controlled Arabia, tales and texts of the Prophet and his miraculous powers filtered in from Mecca and Medina to Delhi and Calcutta with great speed. And as regional flavors of his appropriation gathered momentum, so did the awareness of his universal appeal as a healer, a figure who could offer cures and solutions to epidemics and illnesses that plagued society. This ensured the proliferation of locally produced medical literature in Urdu as by these new Hakims as primers of quick cures. Now, I think that the Unani medicine, which had remained very cautious and cautiously distant from religious reference in practice as well as representation in the high period of Mughal Empire, in this period, and it had refused to incorporate the Tibb-e-Nabawi texts that were floating around. Now, in the 19th century crisis of capitalism and modernity and epidemics and disease, saw no contradiction between the Prophet's prescriptive paths to well-being and its Greco-Arabic philosophical core. In the very eclectic Urdu Unani literature, it was common to find such religious derived practices alongside the endorsement of Galenic philosophy, humoral balancing, and also the use of the more Western derived medical knowledge of anatomy, physiology, and surgery. They all rubbed shoulders now in the 19th century texts with Sufi healing and with Prophet's healing. Prophetic healing or the Tibb-e-Nabawi text set a trend. Soon, many other Hakims used the printing press and the vernacular Urdu to embrace other dispersed authority reference, which I just mentioned, like the Sufi and the Fakir healers. These kind of texts, the Tibb Nabwi, began to proliferate alongside texts that were leaning on Sufi healing and Sufi, Fakir healers. Simultaneously, I think belief in the humoral theory that was central to Unani also continued. In 1878, for instance, Ehsan Ali Khan wrote Tibbe-Ehsani, Medicine of Ehsani, where he views illness in terms of its relationship between the body and the soul, very much like the Sufi healing practices of medieval Islam and the pietist ideas of 18th century Europe. He invokes the superstitious charms of fakirs and Sufis as well in his Unani cures. So, for instance, monga, which is a very precious stone, when tied to the forehead, helps in curing headaches. This was one of his, prescriptions, along with, of course, the humoral balance well-being theories. At the turn of the 20th century, I think this culturally diversified and I would say now religiously alloyed Unani predictably faced a fierce in-house backlash from the old established Persian Arabic knowing medical families with whom I had started this talk, the Shirazis and the Arzanis of Unani, iconic families of Unani healing. These traditional medical families, tracing their genealogies to the Mughals and the Safavids in Iran, had, as we saw earlier, fiercely guarded the textual Greco-Arabic medical knowledge as family tradition. Quite clearly, the new Hakims of modest backgrounds who used the print and the vernacular and the English companies, institutions to diversify Unani now posed a serious threat to these old Perso-Arabic knowing established families of healers. The latter viewed with contempt the incorporation of Sufi practices and the centrality also of the prophetic healing in the Unani Urdu text. They didn't like it at all that Unani had reached out to these learning traditions. They called such practitioners and authors who had adulterated, they argued, Unani by mixing it with religious belief spurious Hakims, Neem Hakim. They warned people against their what they called life-threatening cures. And a very famous phrase, which is still popular and used in northern India at least, about Hakims is Neem Hakim Khatre Jaan, meaning that don't, spurious Hakims who are a threat to human life, stay away from them. And these Neem Hakims are the Urdu vernacular, Tibbe Nabwi, Sufi, healing kind of practices, who had included all these kind of practices into Unani's core. As these older families of Unani healing looked for cover against what they saw as an onslaught of the new Hakim, they turned predictably to whom but the British colonial state. It was the 19th century and the state was very strong and eyeing all these transformations that in a way it had triggered and started. These older families cannibalized the colonial state's arsenal of quote-unquote medical modernity to fight their in-house battles. Traditional Arabic and Persian-driven families supported the English government's demand for professionalization, institutionalization, and modernization of Unani learning. But they covered it with new meanings. Professionalization for them meant hiving off from their tradition the new Urdu-knowing Hakims and the exercise of tighter control of medical knowledge in the hands of older families like before, just hiving off all these frills into which Unani had kind of spilled out. At the turn of the 20th century, families of the Perso-Arabic knowing older traditional families established Unani institutions with state patronage, where existing ideas on anatomy, surgery, and physiology were revised and enhanced with new knowledges and techniques of English doctors. My own maternal family, the Azizi family of Hakims, established one such institution, the Takmil-ut-Tib College, in the city of Lucknow in 1902. This is the college, Tibia College in Delhi. The same idea that older families, the Ajmal Khan family in in Delhi, set up this Tibia College as a response to hive off, the diversification of Unani. And this is my own family's very beautiful early 20th century building, the Takmil-ut-Tib College in Lucknow, set up by my great grandfather, again as a response to hiving off Unani medical knowledge from the influence of the Prophet and the Sufis and all these hanky-panky things, as they would say, that had, created spurious Hakims, Hakims, as from their point of view. In fact, these institutions took pride in their collaborations with English surgeons. These marked the restoration of the control of the old order over medical knowledge, even as you can see, it came packaged in the new vocabulary of professionalization and institutionalization of Unani learning. So, in a way, they used the colonial states' vocabulary and demand for institutionalization to fight their in-house battles, and set up these institutions. And thus, by the early 20th century, Unani derived a very particularistic modernity in the early 20th century, as much as the modernity, interestingly, of English medicine remained very embedded in its dialogue and engagement with Unani in such institutions that you can see here and also outside of them. And this is seldom acknowledged, that the colonial modernity is not a direct kind of export or import into India from the Western world, but it actually develops in dialogue in such institutions with traditional healing like Unani. For instance, in the plague epidemic of 1903, Hakims and English doctors both cooperated to contain the outbreak. Local people for invasive procedures went to the Hakims, freshly trained in surgery by English doctors in such institutions. The English doctors happily played along and learned via observation how to deal and engage with Indian bodies in least alarmist ways. Significantly, an important consequence of this institutionalization of Unani was its positioning of itself as the national medicine of the subcontinent that prided in its rational scientific core. So finally, the older families had kind of won the battle through these institutions. It is true that in the high period of Indian nationalism, when communitarian identities hardened and Hindus and Muslims strived for larger space in the nationalist discourse, Unani also marked itself more than ever before as the Muslim medicine with an Indic history. It showcased the contribution of its Muslim patriarchs towards the intellectual and material well-being of the newly fashioned nation state. And yet, there was no turning back from its showcasing as the scientific medical tradition. For good or bad, in contemporary India, Unani is represented as the Muslim medicine, but with a scientific orientation in its practice. Let me conclude. So I have argued that India's encounter with British rule initiated the first brush with English medicine, and that too within the iniquitous relationship of colonialism. Unani medicine too had a face-off with English medical practice. Unani and English medicine sustained different cultural norms about health and disease, as we saw. However, contrary to conventional historiography that argues for the power of British colonialism to colonize the Indian body, their mutual engagement was more interactive, as I have tried to show. In the face of the colonial encounter, Unani, as we saw, diversified to incorporate many new knowledgeable communities that had hitherto remained outside its fold. Thus, as I showed, it incorporated many religious healing practices related to the Prophet, the faqirs, and the Sufis. And it stepped out of its Perso Arabic frame to flirt with the vernacular languages like Urdu to disseminate its learning more widely in society. But this diversification triggered in house contestation. Older families of Unani healers aimed to retain control over the healing tradition and protect its Greco Arabic core. They did not like this diversification. They often leaned on the British to fight their in house battles. They engaged with the new, quote unquote, modern ideas of institutionalization and professionalization to distance themselves from new practitioners who brought religious reference into Unani healing. In the process, older families who prided themselves in Greco Arabic learning produced a distinct medical modernity for Unani. Their stories, when factored into the history of Unani healing in British India, show how ideas of medical modernity and professionalization are not necessarily singular or definitely not Eurocentric. Instead, these are often the products of the specific ways in which traditional practitioners of medicine resolve in house tensions produced in the colonial context. Viewing the past in the context of the present, I hope to offer fresh insight on Unani representation in government schemes piloted by the Ayush Ministry, with which I began this lecture. I conclude that Unani's inclusion in government schemes marks, I think, the successful culmination of its long and contentious journey in the subcontinent to somehow represent itself as the modern medicine identified closely with Muslims and yet scientific, professional, and institutionalized. On 30th August 2019, a set of commemorative stamps that you can see on the screen here on 12 pathfinding Ayush healers was released by the Postal Department. To the surprise of many Unani practitioners and critics of Ayush, the list included two prominent Hakim patriarchs of the old established Perso-Arabic families of healers. One is my own great-grandfather, the founder of the Takmil-ut-Tib College in Lucknow, Hakim Abdul Aziz. You can see him here, Hakim Abdul Aziz Lucknowi, from a prominent Unani. And the second, is Hakim Kabiruddin on the second stamp there, from a prominent Unani family in Bihar. Significantly, both families had strived for the professionalization and institutionalization of Unani via their books and via setting up institutions. The former established, as I said, the first Unani college in Lucknow in 1902, and the latter authored and helped in the production of a range of Unani books. Via their colleges and books, they strive to preserve the Greco-Arabic philosophical core of Unani and incorporated aspects of English medicine like anatomy, physiology, and surgery, as by the 21st century, this was the preferred language of Muslim education. Hakim Kabiruddin, in particular, wrote books that underlined Unani scientificity and modernity. Books that brought religion into Unani were conspicuous by their absence in his list of publications. And interestingly, he preferred to write in Urdu rather than Arabic or Persian. The selection, I feel, of these two Hakims in the government's list of honors reflects that Unani did succeed in positioning itself as an indigenous medicine that strived to achieve medical modernity on its own terms. This meant primarily, as we saw, dropping its religious frills, restoring its core rational philosophical legacy firmly in the hands of family-established institutions. The institutionalization of Unani kept Islamic religious observance away from medical practice very consciously. This perhaps brought it to the notice of independent India's government schemes in a positive way. Thank you so much. Do I take questions from here?
Yeah.
Historically, did Unani and Ayurveda engage with each other, learn from each other?
So let me just take one or two questions and then I can answer them together.
Yeah. Greco-Roman medicine thrives in the Indian subcontinent in the form of Unani. The government sponsors it. There is a National Institute of Unani Medicine as well. I'm eager to know what accounts for the near total annihilation of Greco-Roman medicine in the land of its origin. Why don't we have a National Institute of Greek Medicine in Greece, for instance?
Respected ma'am, would like to know from you your review. The current madrasas, what kind of scientific temper they're imbibing presently? This question I'm asking because I see long back what the madrasas have done in terms of scientific temper, imbibement. So what is the current scenarios going on exactly, and your review on it?
Okay, so let me take these three. So yes, Ayurveda and Unani had a love and hate relationship through the long temporal period that I am straddling. There was a lot of give and take in terms of materia medica, pharmacopoeias, because in its struggle to prove that even though it had come from the Greco-Arabic world, but it was an Indic, it had developed Indic roots. It was very important for Unani to use Indian materia medica, and one of the most important sources for its knowledge of that materia medica were the Veds and the Ayurvedic, healers. I was at the TUD University today in the morning, and I was talking with colleagues there, and it was very reassuring for me to see that they told me that of the many materia medica and pharmacopoeias in Unani, out of, I think they said 200 or even more, only 3 are external to the subcontinent. The rest are all Indic. So obviously, this conversation with Ayurveda proved to be very useful for the Unani practitioners to reach their goal of proving that they also had Indic roots, even though they had come from outside. And yet, I think in the high period of nationalism, when communitarian identities, and this I'm talking about outside the realm of medical histories, in general, communitarian identities were solidifying and hardening, and Hindus and Muslims had their different agendas, and Gandhi and others were trying to bring them together. And I don't want to bore you as a historian with all that politics of the national movement, but I'm sure many of you are aware of the hardening of communitarian identities from the late 19th, early 20th century. At that time, there was great animosity between associations of Unani medicine and associations of Ayurvedic medicine. I shouldn't say animosity, but there was a kind of marking of difference. And allegations and counter allegations doing the rounds about, who was there was a contestation, let me put it like that, between occupying the national space and proving yourself to be the national medicine. So in those, the debates between, the associations of Unani and associations of Ayurveda in the high period of nationalism are pretty contentious. So it depends on, the moment in history, the temporal moments in history, and there's no one, standard long-term relationship. It varies depending on which period you are talking about. As far as the question of why in Greece, for instance, you don't have Unani medicine, that's a very interesting question. And I think that the answer to that lies in the fact that it's interesting that a lot of the Greco-Roman texts and healing traditions and practices got got translated into Arabic and then into Latin, and then were disseminated to, the various hospitals and learning schools all over Europe. And I think that in that process, of they being translated into Latin and then knowledge being disseminated in that form in the rest of Europe, the influence of the very fast growing biomedical ethics and tradition in the European world kind of, took over to the almost marginalization of these earlier traditions. But I must say that when I travel to that part of the world now, it seems that there is a resurgence of leanings and tapping on these, what they call now alternate medicines, which are basically these forms of healing.
We have state-sponsored, government-sponsored institutes here for Unani. They don't have government-sponsored institutes for Greek medicine.
Yes, no.
I think the idea of modern medicine alone can account for that. My whole hypothesis is, I think it relates more to physical realities. The pharmacopoeia of Unani, I think, is heavily dependent upon herbs that are available in the Indian subcontinent. And I think this is the reason. That's my hypothesis. I'm not sure of it.
Might be. It's quite plausible that that is the case. Yes, and the madrasa. Well, that's something you are touching a raw nerve here, So, the madrasa traditionally was a school of learning, as I have shown. The Calcutta Madrasa was established in that same spirit of learning. A madrasa in the subcontinent and even now in the Middle Eastern world does not mean necessarily only religious learning. It's like a school, it means all kinds of learning. From the from the late Mughal Empire, 18th century, there was a conscious effort to kind of treat or to create pedagogies in madrasas that were both rational, scientific, and religious. So religion was not thrown away, but it was taught alongside rationality and mathematics and all of that. So this is the traditional concept of a madrasa, a school of learning, and not only religious learning. But I think that over a period of time, again, because not in a universal kind of way, not in a generalized kind of way, but because of certain regional, local, specific, particular considerations, which include even simple things like earning a living for families, notable families in small towns or villages. Many of the madrasas got reduced to only religious learning. The answer to your question is that I would not say that madrasas have gone through a teleological evolutionary path, from being very robust spaces of learning to becoming, religious hubs only. It's not so evolutionary. It's not so teleological. It's traditionally the concept has been, a school of learning, and depending on the temporality and the local and the specific particular requirements, some have diversified, some have kind of narrowed down to only religious learning. So even I think you are referring to the current contemporary controversies about madrasas, but I think there my take would be that even in the current contemporary controversies, you can't make a generalized argument. Even now, you can't do that. So, for example, the Firangi Mahal Sunni learning madrasa in Lucknow, established in the 18th century, was one of the first institutions which kind of began to teach botany, science, all kinds of science subjects, along with jurisprudence and Islamic jurisprudence and all of that. And so, especially Islamic jurisprudence, that is Islamic law, became a very, very important pedagogical learning tool in the madrasas right from the 17th, 18th century. Even now, it's being taught there.
Thank you for the very interesting
Where is that
talk
question?
here.
Okay, sorry. Yes.
Yeah, thank you for the very interesting talk. Also, I noticed you put up very beautiful pictures of the Hakims, and so I was just wondering, were women allowed to practice as Hakims? And if yes, are there any prominent examples of such women?
Yes. Let me take 2 or 3 questions at a time.
So, towards the beginning of your talk, you mentioned about the Persian and the shift to Saudi Arabia to Arabic, and you mentioned that even though it was called Unani medicine, it is mostly maintenance of health and well-being. And later, when you showed pictures, it seems like treatment. So, is this conception of maintenance of health and well-being to treatment of diseases, did that evolve through the period or through the transition from Persian to Arabic and then to back and then into India? That's my question.
One more? Yes.
How much of the Unani practices been validated through the modern, control trials? Is there any document on that?
Right. So, very interesting questions. Thank you. So, women, answer is a no. Up to the early 20th century. In fact, I remember my grandmother always complaining about her father, whose picture you saw and who's such a celebrated, iconic figure, that don't believe what people say about him. He did not give me an opportunity to study in the institution that he established. And I remember also very fondly, and I used to laugh when I was writing my own book, Islam and Healing, from which this talk I gave, my own mother saying to me, don't praise them too much. They excluded all the women in the family from their project. So yes, the answer to your question is this, that no. But now, of course, it's different. Once Unani got institutionalized, professionalized, taken out of the hold of family, traditions from families such as my own, and their institutions that I showed you got nationalized, and then of course women were allowed to take the exam, come study like men. So of course now in my own family, it's like the women are having the last laugh, as it was, because there are a couple of aunts and cousins of mine who are practicing Hakims, but it's in the 20th century, not in the period I was talking about.
Hey, good evening, ma'am. Actually,
Yes.
I just have like a question where, like, so the Unani medicine, right? Like the industrialization and the professionalism of the Unani medicine when it was like introduced. So I have a question: did it unite the community, like the Hindu, Muslims, and the castes, or did it actually deepen the caste system or the difference between communities? And like, was it ever used as a political tool?
That's a very. I'll come to the other 2 questions also. Can I just answer this and then the 2 that I left out? So that's a very interesting question. I was talking to Sudhir and others in the morning, and I think that from 1900 to 1920s was a period where whether it was Ayurveda or whether it was Siddha or whether it was Unani, all these indigenous medical traditions were getting institutionalized. If you look at the dates of the institutions of indigenous healing, all of them are 1902, 3, 13, 12, whatever. And I think that in that sense, to answer your question, the unity was, I would say, of an elite class. Whose family traditions were becoming, were being institutionalized. And so in that sense, they were all, kind of, they were on the same page, as it were. But at the same time, the communitarian identities had hardened, and that was reflected in the debates between them.
Yeah, just to follow up a little bit, so like,
We can talk after this. Yeah.
Is it proper to call the Unani system an Islamic system? I don't think it is. The Tibbe Nabawi is not knowledge acquired from the Prophet, actually, because this actually Unani is from Greece, okay, as the so it's and it developed in mostly in Baghdad, in what was called the Darul Hikmat, for example, and I think Hakim comes from there. So I think it's not proper to call it as Islamic medicine. It is actually very secular.
Yes, so I think that that's what that the Hakims also resented to the Prophet's medicine being pulled into the Unani lexicon. That's what I was arguing, and they didn't like it, and they always, maintained a cautious distance. And in fact, as I said, they called Hakims who were doing it spurious Hakims. So you are very right. So it was really not part of the, it was a Unani medicine. They wanted to retain that core. They wanted to retain its name, its neutrality, and they did not like, as I argued, these kind of pressures to pull it in these other directions. And in fact, those who were pulling it, they were calling them spurious Hakims. So you are very right.
Oh, by the way, it was Avicenna, who actually lived in 11th century, who was also probably associated with the House of Wisdom
Very much.
during the caliphate of Harun al-Rashid, who actually got a lot of this translated into Persian, Arabic actually, because even though they spoke Persian, the official language was Arabic. Most of the people who were Persians, they actually wrote in Arabic.
Yes, you're right. Actually, the question here, your question about data, kind of, is there any data on the Unani tradition corresponding to what I think the question. Say that again. Yeah, trials. Yes, I don't know actually. I don't know, but I think that now from the 1970s onwards, I do know that at least a lot of the pharmacopoeias and the materia medica that they were using was put through trials, because there was an effort to market it in a certain way, which actually never really picked up in the way in which it picked up for Ayurveda. But the materia medica and pharmacopoeia, yes, it was put through trials. But the whole concept of healing and well-being and all that, I'm not too sure.
Okay, just a couple of questions, one from me, one from Dr. Prakash.
Yes.
So you've talked about the influence that the Western medicine had on the Unani system. Is there a recognizable diffusion of what was known into Western medicine from the Unani system that we can identify today?
Yes.
My question is, in your journey of deciphering and, mining many issues, Ayurveda has done a lot of experiments in terms of reverse epidemiology. In other words, the epidemiological observational science became first, and then the medicine evolved as a result of it. And also the modern rethinking of reverse pharmacology, which Dr. Ashok Vaidya from Mumbai did that whole concept. And the CSR, golden triangle kind of a thing where knowledge was picked up and put. So where do you place this in your experience, both from a family-wise and as a historian? Where do you put this?
Right.
Okay, we have one last question.
Thank you. So I just wanted to ask you, now it is part of Ayush. So do we have data? Who are the users? And in comparison to all of these other 5, how is it doing?
Right.
because you don't see many Unani practitioners around you.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that is basic.
Yes. Well, to answer your question, I don't know if we have data on that, but I do share your observation that of the traditions listed in Ayush, I think one of the most invisible ones is Unani. And well, I mean, right. Yes. 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 But Jamia Hamdard is interesting because although it is Jamia Hamdard, it is really it is using the money of the Hamdard company that made money out of Unani. It's not really, the university is not about Unani healing. They have a department. Yes, they have a department. You're right. But in terms of invisibility, yes, and there are many political reasons for that, which we need not discuss here, but you are right. I share your observation. Yes, for you, I think that, I think both your questions are more or less, kind of on the same. So I'll answer both together, which is that all the experimentations and all the kind of things are and data collection and data comparisons, everything in Unani, as far as I know, is about pharmacopoeia and materia medica. There is, at least in my knowledge, very little on other aspects. Even in terms of a reverse diffusion that you were asking from Unani into biomedicine, I think it is the materia medica and the pharmacopoeia. Historically, huge evidence in the time of medical crisis, epidemics. Cholera and plague being the two, especially cholera, being the two most important reference of epidemic, crisis in the 19th, early 20th century, when the pharmacopoeias and materia medica of Unani were tried, tested, disseminated, kind of spread, and a lot of success stories are there about their thing. But apart from pharmacopoeias and materia medica, I'm not aware of other, trials or other kind of things.
Okay, we'll conclude now, and please join me in thanking Professor Alavi for a wonderful talk.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you again for having me, and I hope that I kept your attention going, which was a challenge for me, and thanks again.
Well, we hope the other speakers tomorrow also draw the same audience and keep the attention going.
Okay. So, as is traditional at the Indian Academy of Sciences, we always felicitate our public speakers. So, I have the pleasure of doing this for Seema today. So, let me just go through the...
Thank you. So, that's pretty. This is the traditional style. Okay, wow. Thank you. Thank you so much. Oh, oh, thank you so much. So I take it with the tray. It won't stand. Thanks a lot. Thank you so much. So this is lovely and such an honor. And
that's all.
As you probably
thank you so much.
As you probably know, the academy was founded by C.V. Raman. So this is a book on him.
Thank you.
This is gifted to us.
Thank you, Geti. Thank you so much. That's a real. So pleased. Thanks a lot. Thank you so much. Hi. I'll take it.
So with that, we have formally come to the conclusion of today's proceedings. We look forward to welcome you back tomorrow. The sessions will resume at 9:30. Now we will proceed to the conference dinner. So please do join us. There are vehicles parked on the right side of the building. Those of you who can make on your own, please do proceed to the venue dinner. That's Raman Research Institute. Thank you and wish you a pleasant evening.